If you've ever felt like the things that are important to the church that you belong to, or maybe to the Christians that are around you, aren't necessarily Jesus, well then maybe it's appropriate for us to look at this book to the church in Colossae that Paul wrote. Now, Paul is writing this letter for a couple of different reasons. One, because he's heard some different reports coming out of this church that make him a little bit worried about what's going on there. And secondly, he wants it as a companion letter to a letter that he's writing to Philemon, who's a member of this church in Colossae. And Philemon is going to be receiving back a runaway slave named Onesimus. Onesimus had run away from Philemon, had found Paul. Paul had converted him to Christianity, and they realized in the middle of that a relationship needed to be rebuilt there. So Paul sent Onesimus back with Philemon, and we'll deal with that letter later. But this letter to the Colossians is written at the same time. It goes with Tychicus, as Tychicus travels with Onesimus to go see Philemon. And one of the things that is happening in the church in Colossae is that they seem to be adding different kinds of things into their worship of Jesus. And this is natural. Often the different kinds of practices, their cultural backgrounds and other kinds of things, we kind of incorporate them into the way that we worship Christ. And in some ways it's not necessarily bad, but sometimes they become more important, or we focus more on them than we do on who Jesus is. And this, Paul says, is wrong. In this letter, we have one of the clearest statements for the divinity of Jesus, for the ways in which Jesus is unique and is God in the flesh. This is from Colossians 1 verse 15. Paul says, "The Son, Jesus, is the image or the icon, the exact representation of the living and invisible God. He is the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven or on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created for him and through him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, making peace through his blood shed on the cross." So Paul says these other things might be important, and they might be good, and they may even be useful in some ways, but they are not the most important. And anytime they become the most important thing in our lives, at any time and at any moment, whether they're a value that our culture and our current society holds to be most important, whether it's a certain practice that our religious system has seemed to be as most important, whether it's something in a tradition or a habit that we have gotten into as a particular community that seems to become central. If any of these things become more important than the fact that Jesus was God, he came to be among us, and he died to set us free from all of those things, then Paul says that is not good. This brings us then to what I think is the key verse in Colossians. Given that that's who Jesus was and what he has done for us, then this, Colossians 3, verse 1. "Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So then, Paul says, we should live differently than the world around us. We shouldn't just travel or go after all of those different kinds of things that the world seems to see as most important. We shouldn't put ourselves and our desires or our wants ahead of other people or other kinds of things. Instead, we should live in a way that is loving, caring, and peaceful to all those who are around us. Live like Jesus lived before us. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, let's clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Let's bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has any grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. And over all these virtues, let's put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity.